Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another video in Paragon's new YouTube series. In our last video, we did a deep dive into the Audio Research i50 integrated tube amplifier and why it can be a great choice for users new to tubes or to the hobby in general. Today, we'll be talking about another important topic to newer hobbyists, cabling. Sound quality is of utmost importance to music lovers, but getting consistent performance can be a challenge without quality interconnects. Anyone putting together a hi-fi system, whether it's their first or not, will have to have the correct cables to bring the system together. The proper cabling can focus sound and lower the noise floor, while also improving tonal balance and dynamic range. But knowing what you need can be confusing, so let's break it down together now. This is also a big topic, so I want to point out that today we'll be covering analog audio cables. Digital and video cables will be featured in part 2 of this video. Analog cables are used to transmit analog signals. They can be used to interconnect audio equipment like preamplifiers and turntables, or amplifiers and speakers. Analog audio cables include single-ended or RCA cables, phono cables, balanced or XLR cables, speaker cables, and headphone cables. RCA or single-ended cables are among the most common interconnects, and you've likely used this type of cable if you own AV equipment. RCA cables work by using 2 wires, one to transmit audio signal, and one that carries a reference voltage, or a ground. Fun fact, RCA stands for Radio Corporation of America, and the first RCA cables were designed for connecting a phonograph turntable to a radio in order to get more sound amplification. A single RCA cable was used, so the sound was in mono, or just one channel of sound. The modern RCA cables that you'll likely encounter come in pairs, which connect to your right and left sound channels to create stereo sound. At this point, you may be wondering, if RCA cables were invented to be used with turntables, why did we make a distinction between RCA and phono cables in our intro? Phono cables are typically a pair of regular RCA cables, but they have the addition of a single cable called a ground wire. The ground wire's job is to put your turntable chassis and amplifier at the same ground potential. Without equalizing the ground potential between your turntable and amp, something called a ground loop can occur. Now, this can all get pretty technical, but it helps to think about one of the core goals of quality cabling, which is to reduce noise in your system. Vinyl playback in particular is really sensitive to noise because the preamplifier has to work super hard to boost such a small sound signal. A ground loop occurs when the turntable chassis and amplifier are not at the same ground potential, and alternating currents start looping through your cabling between the equipment. This is an audible phenomenon that you may experience as hum through your speakers when the phono input is selected on your amp. By using a grounding wire with your phono cables, that extra current that can cause the dreaded ground loop is essentially provided an off-ramp that diverts it away from your system. Project Audio, a leading analog company specializing in turntables, sums this up in a super user-friendly way. A grounding wire is a safety wire that has intentionally been connected to earth and does not carry electricity under normal circuit operations. It's almost like a bucket picking up the spare water so a room doesn't flood, except instead of mitigating water, it's scooping up electrical current that could cause excess hum or charge. Now that we know how single-ended cables and phono ground wires work, let's move on to balanced or XLR cables. XLR stands for external line return, and just like RCA versus single-ended, XLR and balanced are generally used interchangeably. Remember how we said that RCA cables contain 2 wires, one to transmit the signal and one to provide a reference voltage for grounding? In balanced cables, there are 3 wires instead of 2. The idea here is that you have a positive conductor, a negative conductor, and a ground wire providing the reference voltage. So what does this extra wire in the cable do for you? Essentially, by having a positive and negative conductor, much of the noise that an unbalanced connection, like an RCA cable inherently has, will be canceled out and not transmitted through to your equipment and speakers. Very generally speaking, you'll find XLR connections as options on higher performance audio gear, And balanced cables do tend to be more expensive than single-ended because their construction is more complicated and requires more raw materials. Let's move on now to speaker cables. As the name implies, these are the interconnects that join your amplifier to your speakers. Speaker cable construction can also get very complicated and technical, so let's try to keep things simple. The electrical current in your speaker cables must be high-powered and well-matched to your system in order to properly move the magnets in the speaker drivers that ultimately produce the sound we hear. Backing up for just a second, remember that when you choose components like speakers and amplifiers, you need to make sure that they're impedance matched. Impedance can be a weird concept to wrap your head around, but essentially it's a measure of how much your speakers will resist the current provided by your components via your cabling. But here's where it can feel counterintuitive. Speakers with lower impedance resist current less, which means that they will draw more power from your amplifier, which is why low impedance speakers are sometimes referred to as power hungry or difficult to drive. When equipment is impedance matched, the maximum power transfer can occur properly. When impedance is mismatched, all sorts of problems can occur, most of which will introduce noise into the system, exactly what we're trying to avoid. Don't get overly stressed about this concept though. Just make sure to check the impedance specs on your equipment and speakers before purchasing, information that should be readily available to you with simple research. So, now we're all caught up with how to match our components so that our speaker cables can function properly. Speaker cable construction also plays into those same principles with everything from wire gauge to length and equipment impedance affecting how the cables transmit the signal current. So do pay attention to these factors when selecting your speaker cables and contact a reputable audio dealer if you have any questions on what to choose. Generally speaking, you'll have one speaker cable for each channel of audio that you're connecting, and that cable will have what we refer to as terminations. Terminations simply refer to the ends of the cable that connect to your equipment and speakers. Common speaker cable terminations include spades and bananas, along with variations like bent or flat spades, locking bananas, etc. The best termination to select is the one that works with your amplifier and speakers to create a tight, secure connection for the audio signal. Again, ask your local dealer for help if you're unsure of what to choose. Before we move on, I do want to go back to my statement that generally you'll have one speaker cable for each channel of audio. It's true that you'll need at least one cable per speaker, but there are times when people might choose to bi-amp or bi-wire their speakers, in which case they'll use an additional set of speaker cables. When you bi-wire your speakers, it means that there are two speaker cables connected to the same output tap on your amplifier that go to two sets of terminals on your speaker. To keep things tidier in your cabling, you can choose special speaker cables designed for bi-wiring. In a bi-amped system setup, each speaker will use two amplifiers, one for higher frequencies and one for low frequencies. In this case, you would need a second set of speaker cables. The last type of cable that we're going to cover today is headphone cables. Just like amps and speakers, there are impedance matching issues to consider between your headphone amp and your headphones. High-performance headphone cables account for these issues, and there are even model-specific cables for the ultimate matched performance. Another benefit of a specialized headphone cable is the ability to tailor the connectors so you can really customize your personal listening setup. For example, all transparent audio headphone cables come with one detachable headphone lead with a connector option of your choice. You can also purchase additional connectors separately through a transparent dealer, which has the benefit of allowing you to use just one main cable for different headphones if you have more than one pair you regularly listen to. The other thing we like about Transparent's headphone cable is that all single, dual, and balanced headphone amp terminations are available, as well as changeable amp ends as a custom option in case you have multiple amps that you'd like to use. We've gone through a lot of information here, and hopefully it's a starting off point for thinking about your cabling as an important part of creating the best sounding hi-fi system you can have. Sometimes your equipment will come with what we refer to as stock cables, or generic interconnects that can be used with your equipment safely. That being said, if you want your system to realize its full potential, we strongly recommend building high-performance cabling into your overall system budget. Your cabling budget is a personal choice, and the good news is that brands like Transparent Audio have many performance levels at a number of price points to align with the budget that you set. Once you set your budget, consider all of the interconnects and cables that you'll need, and choose a consistent performance level across your entire system if at all possible. In other words, don't blow the budget on the most expensive speaker cables you can afford while neglecting your other interconnects. It's a better strategy to cable consistently throughout. Transparent Audio, for example, offers a really attractive upgrade program. So once your cabling is in place, there are cost-effective ways to move up through the performance levels over time to achieve even higher cabling benefits. At the end of the day, using high-quality cables and interconnects in your system will allow your equipment to perform to its highest potential, and should be one of the first things you evaluate if you feel like your system isn't singing the way you feel it should. Always lean on your local hi-fi dealer if you're feeling confused or unsure about which cables to select. A good dealer will be able to work with you on options and budget to suggest a cabling strategy that will create a strong foundation for your system. Next time, we'll go over digital cabling. Like I said, this is a big topic to cover in one video. If there's any information you're curious about that we didn't cover here, or that you just want more detail on, please contact us. Also, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for future videos.